My name is Elena Morgan, and if someone had told me 10 years ago that my own children would one day turn their backs on me, I would have laughed. I would have called them crazy, because I raised my kids with everything I had: love, sacrifice, sleepless nights, and dreams that weren't even mine anymore. I gave them my life, and yet, one morning I woke up to realize I had become a stranger in my own family. It didn't happen overnight, but when it did, it destroyed me from the inside. I still remember that day, like it was yesterday, the day my youngest, Lily, looked me in the eye and said, "Mom, maybe it's time you stop controlling everything." Her words felt like a knife sliding between my ribs. Controlling? Me? All I ever did was hold the family together. But that day, something inside me cracked. It was the beginning of the end. I had always been proud of my family. 2 kids, Daniel and Lily, a loving husband, Richard. We were never rich, but we were happy, or at least that's what I believed. We had our little 2-story home in the suburbs, full of laughter, late-night talks, and Sunday breakfasts that smelled like pancakes and coffee. But sometimes, the loudest laughter hides the deepest cracks. I started noticing the small things first. The way Daniel, my eldest, stopped calling as often after he moved out. How Lily became distant, more secretive. How Richard seemed tired all the time, eyes heavy with something I couldn't name. I thought maybe it was just the stress of growing up, of life moving too fast. But no, it was something else. Something much darker. The truth began to unfold slowly, like a storm creeping in from the horizon. It started with money. Always the money. Daniel had borrowed some from me a few months earlier, just until I get promoted, Mom. I didn't think twice. I wired him the amount without asking questions. That's what mothers do. They trust. But months passed, and every time I brought it up, he changed the topic. Then one day, I found a message on my phone not meant for me. A message from Lily to Daniel, asterisk, "Don't tell her yet." She freak out. Dad said to keep it quiet for now. My heart skipped a beat. Keep what quiet? What were they hiding from me? That night I waited until everyone was asleep. I sat in the dark living room, phone in hand, staring at that message again and again, feeling my chest tighten with something I hadn't felt in years: fear. The next morning, I asked Richard casually if something was going on. He smiled that tired smile and said, "Elena, you worry too much. Everything's fine." But his eyes didn't match his words. They looked guilty, haunted. That's when I started digging. Quietly, carefully, because I knew something was terribly wrong. A week later, I found the first clue. A document tucked inside Richard's drawer. It was a property paper, our house deed, but it didn't have my name on it anymore. My heart stopped. My hands trembled as I stared at it. My name, the woman who had paid half the mortgage, who worked nights at the diner and days at the school just to make ends meet, was gone. And in its place were 3 names: Richard Morgan, Daniel Morgan, Lily Morgan. Not Elena, me. I remember running into the kitchen, clutching that paper, shouting, "What is this? Why isn't my name here?" Richard froze. Daniel looked away. Lily bit her lip. No one said a word for a few seconds that felt like a lifetime. Finally, Richard sighed and said, "Elena, calm down. It's just a formality. We were restructuring the ownership for tax reasons. But I wasn't stupid. I wasn't blind. Tax reasons? I whispered, my voice shaking. You erased me from my own home. That was the first time I saw the truth in their faces, the truth I never wanted to believe. My family, my blood, had betrayed me. I locked myself in my room that night. I cried until I couldn't breathe. Every memory, every birthday, every scraped knee, every bedtime story flashed before my eyes. And I kept asking myself why. Why would they do this to me? What did I do wrong? For days I lived in silence. They walked on eggshells around me, pretending everything was fine, pretending the storm wasn't tearing through my heart. But inside, I was already breaking. I stopped cooking, stopped talking. The laughter that once filled our home had turned into quiet tension. But even then, even in that suffocating silence, a part of me refused to give up. A part of me whispered, "Find out everything, Elena. Don't let them bury you alive." That's when my pain turned into purpose. I began watching, listening, waiting. I noticed how Richard made frequent phone calls late at night, whispering in the hallway. I noticed how Daniel and Lily suddenly started talking about the new place and moving things around. They didn't know I heard them. They didn't know I was piecing everything together, bit by bit. And one night, when everyone was asleep, I followed my instincts. I unlocked Richard's briefcase. Inside, I found the final piece of betrayal, a bank document showing a large transaction. Money from our joint savings account, nearly everything we had, transferred to an account under Daniel's name. My hands went cold. My whole world tilted. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just betrayal. It was erasure. They were cutting me out of my own life, my husband and my children, my family. I sank to the floor, clutching that paper, whispering through tears, "Why? Why would you do this to me?" And as I sat there in the dark, surrounded by silence and secrets, a new voice rose inside me, a voice I hadn't heard in years. It said, "They took everything from you, Elena, but they have no idea what you're capable of." I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I sat on the cold floor until dawn, staring at those documents, the proof of my family's betrayal. My tears had dried, leaving only silence and a burning emptiness inside me. I used to believe that love was enough to hold a family together, that no matter what happened, my children would always stand by me. But now, looking at the morning light spilling through the window, I knew that love wasn't enough. Love had been replaced by greed, and I was just an obstacle standing in their way. The next morning, I walked into the kitchen as if nothing had happened. Richard was sitting at the table, reading the newspaper. Daniel was scrolling through his phone, and Lily was making coffee. The scene looked normal, almost peaceful, but I could feel the tension like a knife in the air. "Morning," I said, my voice calm. They all looked up, surprised. Maybe they thought I'd break down again, scream or cry. But I didn't. I smiled instead. "We should have dinner together tonight," I said softly. "Like old times?" Richard blinked, suspicious. "Dinner?" he asked. "Why suddenly?" I shrugged. "Because it's been too long since we sat together as a family." Daniel exchanged a quick glance with Lily, who nodded slowly. "Sure, Mom," Lily said. "That would be nice." I could see the relief in their eyes. They thought I was forgiving them, but they were wrong. I was observing every movement, every word, every flicker of guilt on their faces. That day, while they were all out, I started digging deeper. I went to the bank. The manager looked uncomfortable when I asked about the recent transfers, but I smiled and said I just needed clarity for our family finances. What I learned that day made my heart turn to stone. Richard had been planning to sell our house for months. The documents were ready. The buyer was already lined up. The transaction date? 2 weeks from now. 2 weeks until I'd be left with nothing. My own husband had planned it so neatly, changing ownership, transferring funds, hiding details under my nose. And my children, they knew. They were helping him, because in return, Richard had promised them a share money for Daniel's new business and Lily's dream apartment. My entire life's work divided like inheritance. While I was still alive, I walked out of that bank with shaking hands, but a strange calm inside me. I wasn't going to cry anymore. I wasn't going to beg. They had taken everything from me, but they underestimated one thing: my strength. They thought I was weak because I loved them too much. But love, when betrayed, becomes something far more powerful. It becomes fire. That night, during dinner, I watched them laugh and talk like nothing had happened. Richard poured wine into my glass and said, "It's good to see you smile again, Elena." I smiled back. "Of course," I said. "Family is everything, isn't it?" He nodded, clueless. I sat there playing along while my mind raced with thoughts. I didn't know what my revenge would look like yet, but I knew one thing: I would make them feel what I felt, slowly, deeply, without warning. Over the next few days, I started collecting evidence. I made copies of every bank document, every paper I could find. I photographed Richard's emails, recorded phone calls quietly from the living room. I even reached out to an old friend of mine, Claire, who worked at a law office. She helped me understand the legal side, how ownership transfers worked, what loopholes I could use. And that's when I discovered something interesting. Even though they had removed my name from the deed, the house was originally bought using funds from my personal inheritance. That meant I still had a legal claim. But if the sale went through before I acted, it would be too late. I had 2 weeks to turn the tables. 2 weeks to outsmart the people I loved most. I started acting distant again, pretending to sink into sadness. Richard began avoiding me, spending more time at work. Daniel barely came by. Lily, on the other hand, visited often, maybe out of guilt. She'd sit beside me and say things like, "Mom, you have to move on. Dad just wants what's best for all of us." Every word cut deeper. Move on? From what? Being erased. One afternoon, while she was in the kitchen, her phone buzzed. I glanced at it. A message preview flashed across the screen. Asterisk, make sure she doesn't find out before next week. Dad's nervous. That was the confirmation I needed. They were in it together until the very end. That night, I called Claire again. I told her everything. She listened quietly and then said, "Elena, you have a strong case, but you have to act smart. Don't let them see you coming." I nodded. That was exactly what I intended to do. Over the next few days, I began quietly setting my plan in motion. I contacted the buyer. Richard was dealing with an older man named Mr. Wallace. I told him, politely, that there was a dispute over ownership and advised him not to proceed until the matter was resolved. He was cautious enough to agree. Then I changed the passwords on our shared accounts, froze transfers, and reached out to a real estate lawyer who drafted a legal notice. My heart pounded as I signed it. It wasn't just a document, it was the first step toward reclaiming myself. A few nights later, Richard confronted me. "Elena," he said, voice tense, "did you do something with the bank accounts? I can't access them." I looked at him calmly. "I did," I said. "I thought it was time I took control of my own money again." He stared at me, stunned. "Elena, what are you doing? You're being unreasonable." I laughed quietly. "Unreasonable? No, Richard. I was unreasonable when I trusted you." He clenched his jaw but didn't speak. For the first time, he looked nervous. It was a small victory, but it felt like breathing again after drowning for weeks. Daniel tried to talk to me the next day. "Mom, you're making things complicated," he said. "Dad just wants to make sure the house benefits everyone." "Everyone except me," I replied coldly. He frowned. "You're overreacting." Overreacting. The word echoed in my mind. How easily they dismissed my pain. They didn't understand that this wasn't just about a house. It was about betrayal. About being erased by the very people I had sacrificed everything for. But I didn't tell him that. I just smiled and said, "You'll understand soon." As I said those words, I knew I was no longer the same woman I used to be. I was done begging for love or loyalty. Now I was preparing for justice. And deep down, I knew that when my children finally saw what I had planned, they would realize that their mother wasn't someone to underestimate. They thought they could take everything from me quietly. But they didn't see this coming. From the moment I decided not to be a victim anymore, everything I did had to be precise, quiet, and unexpectedly gentle, because the best traps are the ones set with a smile. I started small, the way a chess player moves a pawn to control the center of the board. I couldn't simply shout my truth and expect them to believe me. They had rehearsed their lies and wrapped them in comforting words. So I learned to walk among those words like a ghost, unseen but watching. The first move was to tighten the legal noose without making it obvious. I worked with Claire and the real estate lawyer to draw up a notice of claim against the property, carefully citing the source of the original down payment, my inheritance, supported by old bank slips and letters I had kept hidden in the attic for years. I mailed the papers through a third party so no one could trace them back to me immediately. Meanwhile, I continued to live as if nothing had changed, smiling at family gatherings, folding laundry, and humming the same old songs my children used to sing. They began to get nervous in ways they couldn't hide. Daniel's jokes became sharper, Lily's eyes more restless. I watched them flinch at the smallest disruptions, and every flinch was proof that my plan was working. But legal pressure alone wouldn't be enough. Betrayal is not just a crime of law. It is an assault on the heart, and hearts are broken by exposure and humiliation as much as by contracts. So I started to expose the pattern of lies in ways they couldn't ignore. I found a way into Richard's email account, old passwords he used that I remembered from years ago. It felt like slipping into a stranger's house and finding all the secrets laid out on the kitchen table. There were messages to contractors, notes about the buyer, and most damning of all, texts where he coached Daniel on what to say if I asked questions. I printed everything. I arranged the pages into a neat stack and one evening left them on the kitchen table where the family would see them when they came home. I knew how simple such a thing looked, like a clumsy trap, but the illusion was the point. The next morning, Daniel stormed into the kitchen, eyes wild, and his voice cracked as he demanded, "Mom, what is this?" I looked at him, my face calm, my hands folded, and I said nothing. The silence was heavier than any accusation. That day, words were weapons in my hands, soft, cutting, and exact. Daniel tried to deny it at first, but the printed messages were a map he couldn't redraw. Lily burst into tears, not because she felt guilty, but because she finally saw the face of the truth, and it scared her. Richard stood by the sink, staring at the pages like a man watching a fire consume his own plans. They began to fight among themselves, voices rising, accusations bouncing like stones off walls. I sat at the edge of the table, a cup of tea cooling in my hands, and listened. I let them tear each other apart while I collected the pieces. I used their anger to my advantage. When tempers flared, people make mistakes, quick signatures, hurried phone calls, whispered admissions. I recorded one conversation when Daniel called the buyer and tried to persuade him to push the sale through before any legal hiccup. He said things he thought would never be used against him. He promised favors, joked about outsmarting me, and laughed about how easy it had been to make me invisible. That recording became another carefully placed jewel in my crown. I never used shame for the sake of cruelty. My aim was to reclaim what was mine and to teach them that betrayal left scars no one could ignore. So I began leaking controlled pieces of the truth to the people who mattered in their lives. I sent anonymized copies of the emails to the buyer's attorney, to Richard's colleagues, and to Daniel's business partner. I wrote a polite, factual letter to Lily's landlord indicating that there might be legal complications around funds that had been offered for a new lease. Each revelation was surgical timed to cause maximum disruption to their plans, but minimal harm to innocence. The glorious thing about betrayal is how badly it disguises itself as normalcy. My family had thought their silence could protect them, but secrets are brittle. Once the first crack appears, it spreads. And spread it did. Daniel's business partner stopped returning calls. The buyer delayed the closing. Lily's landlord hesitated on the lease. The ripple effects were small at first, but they converged into a wave that loosened the foundation of their conspiracy. Of course, not every move was legal or clean. Revenge rarely is, but I kept my conscience beside me and checked every tactic against it. I refused to destroy lives, only to expose deception and reclaim my dignity. In secret, I also began rebuilding myself. Betrayal had left me raw, but it had not left me empty. I took up an old hobby, photography, and used it as a way to step outside the anger and see the world with new eyes. I carried my camera when I visited the community center where I volunteered, and slowly People began to notice me again, not as the woman who was wronged, but as someone with value, talent, and resilience. That renewed respect became another weapon, social proof that I was worth more than the role they had tried to assign me. One evening, everything pivoted. I received an invitation to a dinner party hosted by a neighbor whose opinion my family respected. They asked Richard and me to attend. I agreed, and as I dressed, I felt both calm and dangerous, like a river that looks peaceful on the surface but rushes with force underneath. At the party, between polite conversations and clinking glasses, I slipped into the role of the gracious hostess who loved her family. Then, when the wine had loosened tongues and the room hummed with small talk, I asked a quiet question in a voice everyone could hear. Has anyone here ever been in a situation where someone tried to erase them? The silence that followed was immediate and full of meaning. People exchanged looks. I watched Richard's face drain of color. Conversations around the table shifted. Heads turned. Whispers began. I let them. Then I told a short, measured version of my story, no screaming, no pleading, just facts and emotion thinly veiled in dignity. I spoke about feeling invisible, about documents that weren't what they seemed, about a love that had been taken for granted. People listened. Faces that once turned away now looked at me with sympathy and, more importantly, with a hint of skepticism toward my family's version of events. That skepticism mattered. It loosened the safety net they'd been hiding under. The next morning, Richardson's boss asked him for clarification about an expense he had suddenly charged to a company account, an expense that matched a contractor's invoice for work on our house. Word traveled. Daniel found himself unexpectedly ostracized at a networking meeting when someone mentioned ethical behavior and he could not provide a convincing response. Lily received a call from an old friend who asked, bluntly, "Are you okay?" People are talking. Each small consequence was a pebble I dropped into the pond of their lives, and each pebble caused ripples that reached further than I could have hoped. They began to understand that hiding me wasn't enough. Their reputations, their relationships, their businesses, all of it was starting to wobble. I watched them from the sidelines and felt a strange mixture of sorrow and determination. I didn't want to relish their discomfort, but I needed them to feel the gravity of what they had done. They had made a choice, and choices have consequences. By now, 2 weeks had passed and legal proceedings were quietly underway. The buyer hesitated, the bank paused the transfer, and the house sale stalled. But this was more than a legal victory. It was a moral assertion that a life built with sacrifice cannot be simply erased with a signature. Still, I knew the biggest battle was yet to come, because winning court papers is one thing. Making your children understand the depth of betrayal is another. I prepared for the next phase not with fury, but with strategy, patience, and the cold steadiness of someone who has been pushed to the edge and learned to stand taller because of it. They thought they had rewritten my story, but I was writing the next chapter, and it would be one they never saw coming. The day everything began to unravel started like any other morning. The sky outside my window was dull and gray, but I felt something stirring inside me, a quiet power I hadn't felt in years. I had spent so long being quiet, being careful, being the one who held everything together. but not anymore. Today, I wasn't going to wait for karma to do its job. I was going to deliver it myself with calm precision and a steady hand. Richard was sitting at the kitchen table, his usual coffee mug in hand, but there was a nervous energy about him. His phone kept lighting up. He'd glance at the screen, then quickly turn it face down. He was expecting someone to call, probably the buyer. I poured myself some tea, my movements slow, deliberate. "Everything all right?" I asked softly. He looked up, startled. Yes, of course. "Just work?" I smiled. "Work seems to be keeping you very busy lately." He nodded and left the table, pretending not to hear the edge in my voice. The door closed behind him, and I sat there for a while, listening to the ticking of the clock. Every sound felt amplified. The kettle whistling, the faint hum of the fridge, even my own heartbeat. I wasn't afraid anymore. The fear had burned away, replaced by something colder clarity. That same afternoon, I got a call from Claire. Her voice carried both excitement and caution. "Elena," she said, "we did it. The injunction went through. The house sale is legally frozen until further notice." I closed my eyes and breathed out slowly. "Thank you," I whispered. "You just gave me my life back." She laughed softly. "Not yet, but we're getting there. Be careful, okay? They're not going to take this quietly." I knew she was right. When Richard found out that his grand plan was collapsing, he wouldn't stay silent. Neither would the kids. But that was fine. Let them rage. Let them shout. I had weathered storms before. I could handle this one. That evening, when Richard came home, he was pale. His jaw was tight, and his voice trembled with forced calm. "Elena, did you file something in court?" he asked. "Because I just got a call from the realtor. The sale's been suspended." I looked him dead in the eye. "Yes, I did." He froze. "Why?" "You're sabotaging everything." "No," I said, standing. "I'm protecting what's mine. What you tried to steal." "Elena, we were doing this for the family," he shouted. "For Daniel and Lily's future." I laughed, bitter and sharp. "Funny how you say family, like it doesn't include me." He took a step closer, his tone softening. "You're emotional. You don't understand how these things work." I met his gaze and said, "No, Richard. You don't understand. You don't get to erase me and then call it business." His face hardened, and for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. Not fear of losing me, but fear of losing control. He stormed out of the room, slamming the door so hard the frame rattled. Minutes later, I heard the sound of his car leaving the driveway. I knew where he was going to Daniel, and that was exactly what I wanted. Let them gather. Let them plot. I was ready for all of it. The next morning, I drove to a quiet cafe across town, where I had arranged to meet Mr. Wallace, the man who was supposed to buy our house. He was older, kind-faced, and cautious. "Mrs. Morgan," he said, shaking my hand, "I've received some concerning updates. Your husband told me everything was fine, but now there's a court order." I nodded. "Mr. Wallace, I'm sorry you got caught in this mess. My husband and children tried to sell the house behind my back. I had to act fast." His brows furrowed. "That's troubling. I don't want to be involved in a family dispute." "You won't be," I said calmly. You can walk away now. I just needed you to know the truth. Please don't let them pressure you into anything." He nodded slowly, eyes softening. "I understand. You're doing the right thing." I thanked him and left. When I got home, I found Daniel's car in the driveway. Inside, the air felt thick. They were all there, Richard, Daniel, and Lily, standing in the living room like a tribunal waiting for me. Daniel was the first to speak. "Mom, what are you doing? You're ruining everything." "Everything?" I said quietly. "You mean your little plan to kick me out of my own house?" "That's not fair," Lily said, tears welling up. "We just wanted stability. Dad said it was temporary." "Temporary?" I whispered. "You erased my name from the deed, took my savings, and called it temporary?" Richard raised his hands. "We didn't mean to hurt you, Elena. You're blowing this out of proportion." I looked at him, and all the memories flooded back, the nights I stayed awake with sick children, the years I worked double shifts while he built his business, the birthdays I missed because I was too tired to stand. I shook my head. "No, Richard. I think for once the proportion fits." Daniel stepped closer. "We can fix this if you just drop the legal stuff." I smiled faintly. "No, Daniel. You'll fix it because you have no other choice." They didn't expect that tone from me. The calm, steady defiance. The woman who used to cry at the slightest argument now spoke like someone who had already won. Because I had. I turned to Lily, whose face was streaked with tears. "You know," I said softly, "I would have given you everything if you'd just asked. But you chose lies instead. And that's something I can't forgive easily." She broke down, covering her face, but I didn't move to comfort her. The time for softness had passed. I left them standing there in silence and went upstairs. Behind the closed door of my bedroom, I felt my legs tremble. Revenge didn't erase the pain. It didn't make the memories disappear. But it gave me something back, my dignity. And that was worth more than anything they had tried to take. The following week, word spread quickly. The buyer withdrew completely. The house sale collapsed. The bank began investigating irregular transactions. And just like that, the empire of lies my family had built crumbled. Richard's reputation took a hit at work. People whispered. Daniel lost a major investor for his startup. Lily's landlord pulled out of the lease, citing instability. They all faced the weight of their own actions, and for the first time, they couldn't blame anyone else. Still, I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate, because this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about truth. It was about reminding them and myself that I existed, that my sacrifices mattered. Days later, Lily came to me quietly, her eyes swollen from crying. "Mom," she whispered, "I'm sorry." I didn't know how far it had gone. I just wanted us to be okay. I looked at her for a long time, my heart heavy. "Then learn from it," I said softly. "Because once trust is broken, it takes a lifetime to rebuild." She nodded, tears falling silently. I reached out and took her hand, not as forgiveness, but as recognition. She squeezed it, and for the first time in weeks, I saw the daughter I used to know, buried beneath the guilt and confusion. That small moment of honesty was all I needed to know that, somewhere beneath the betrayal, love still existed. It was fragile, but real. As for Richard and Daniel, they stayed silent. Maybe out of shame, maybe out of pride. It didn't matter. My story wasn't about them anymore. It was about me, about a woman who had lost everything and found herself again. And though the wounds were still raw, I could finally breathe. I had stood up, fought back, and reclaimed my name, not just on paper, but in my own heart. They didn't see it coming, because they never expected the mother they betrayed to be the one who would teach them the meaning of justice. In the days that followed, the house was quiet again, but not the kind of quiet that comes with peace. It was the silence that follows a storm, where the air still hums with the memory of thunder. I spent hours sitting in the garden, staring at the flowers I had planted years ago, the ones that somehow survived through every season. They reminded me that even when everything around you withers, something always finds a way to bloom again. I was that something now. The storm had passed, and I was still standing. But the final chapter of this story wasn't written yet. I knew there had to be one last conversation, one final moment of truth. Because closure doesn't come from silence, it comes from being heard. It came one evening, just as the sun dipped low and the sky turned the color of burnt orange. I heard the front door open quietly, followed by slow, hesitant footsteps. It was Richard. I didn't look up at first. I wanted him to speak first. "Elena," he said softly, almost like the man I used to know. "Can we talk?" I nodded without turning around. He took a deep breath. "I don't even know where to start," he said. "Everything's falling apart. The bank, the buyer, my job. Daniel blames me. Lily won't talk to anyone. And you," his voice broke slightly, "you've turned everyone against me." I turned then, slowly, and met his eyes. "No, Richard," I said calmly. "You did that yourself." He flinched, the truth stinging like salt on an open wound. He sank into the chair across from me. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he said. "I just thought, after all these years of struggling, we finally had a chance to make things better. I thought you'd understand." "Understand?" I said, my voice trembling not with weakness, but with restrained anger. "You took my name off our house, emptied our savings, and lied to my face. And you thought I'd understand?" He dropped his gaze. "It was wrong," he murmured. "But I didn't know how to stop it once it started. I just kept telling myself it was for the family." I stared at him, wondering how many times I had told myself the same thing, doing everything for the family, sacrificing dreams, comfort, even my own identity. "You use that word like a shield," I said quietly. "But family isn't about who gets what. It's about who stands beside you when you have nothing left. You forgot that somewhere along the way." He looked up at me then, eyes wet. "I know I can't ask you to forgive me." "Good," I said softly. "Because forgiveness isn't a gift, it's something people earn. And you haven't even started." He nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging. There was nothing left for him to say. After a long silence, he stood and said, "I'll be moving out tomorrow. The lawyer said we'll have to sort out the rest legally." I didn't reply. He walked to the door, paused for a second as if hoping I'd stop him, and when I didn't, he left. Just like that, 28 years of marriage ended in a quiet click of a closing door. I didn't cry. There were no tears left, only a deep, strange sense of relief. The next few days were blurry but calm. I started tidying the house not out of habit, but as a ritual of reclaiming it. Every drawer I cleaned, every photo I dusted, felt like removing another layer of the past that had tried to suffocate me. I even changed the locks, not to keep anyone out, but to remind myself that this home now belonged to me, truly and legally. A few days later, Daniel came by. He looked different, older, weighed down. He didn't speak right away. He just stood at the doorway, eyes full of guilt. "Mom," he finally said, "I was wrong." His voice cracked on the last word. I waited, saying nothing. "Dad said it was the smart thing to do," he continued. "He said you wouldn't understand finances and it was better this way." I believed him. I shouldn't have. I just wanted to make him proud. I sighed, my anger softening into sadness. "You're my son, Daniel," I said quietly. "All I ever wanted was for you to be kind, not perfect. But you chose pride over honesty." "I know," he whispered, "and I'll never forgive myself for it." I stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Then learn from it. Be a better man than your father. Don't repeat his mistakes." He nodded, tears forming. "I will, Mom." When he left, I felt a strange warmth in my chest, not forgiveness, but hope. Maybe someday the bond between us could heal. Maybe not completely, but enough to remember that love once lived here. Lily came the next morning, carrying a small box. "I found this," she said softly, handing it to me. Inside were old photos, birthdays, vacations, family dinners. Memories frozen in happier times. "I thought you'd want them," she said. I smiled faintly. "Thank you, sweetheart." She hesitated, then asked, "Can I come home for a while? Just until I figure things out?" I looked at her, really looked at her, the same little girl who used to hold my hand crossing the street, the one who once promised she'd never lie to me. And though my heart was still bruised, I couldn't turn her away. "Yes," I said quietly, "but if you come home, you come home with honesty. No more secrets?" She nodded, her eyes glistening. "I promise." That night, the two of us sat together in the living room, sipping tea and talking, really talking for the first time in months. It felt fragile but real, like rebuilding a house from ashes. Outside, the wind blew softly through the trees, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone. Days turned into weeks. The legal case concluded in my favor. The court reinstated my name on the property and required Richard to return the funds he had withdrawn. The house was mine again, not because of revenge, but because justice had finally spoken. When I walked out of that courtroom, the sunlight felt different, warmer, cleaner. It wasn't victory I felt. It was peace. A peace that comes only after you've walked through fire and realized you're still standing. Life moved on quietly after that. I started teaching part-time at the local community center, something I had always wanted to do but never had time for. I met new people, learned new things, and began to rediscover the version of myself that had been buried under years of sacrifice. And though my family was still fractured, I knew something important. Sometimes broken things aren't meant to go back to how they were. Sometimes they're meant to stay cracked, to let the light in. Months later, I received a letter from Richard. It was short, apologetic. He said he was living alone now, thinking about everything he had lost. He wrote that he finally understood what I had tried to teach the kids all those years ago, that money and control mean nothing if you lose the people who loved you for who you were. I read it once and then set it aside. I didn't need to reply. His words weren't for me, they were for him. I had already made peace with my past. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat on the porch with Lily beside me. The air was cool, and the garden glowed in the fading light. She leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered, "You're stronger than anyone I know, Mom." I smiled. Strength isn't something you're born with, Lily. It's something life gives you when it takes everything else away. She looked at me quietly, as if trying to memorize that sentence. I gazed at the horizon and thought of everything that had happened, the lies, the betrayal, the pain, the justice, and finally, the peace. Betrayal had broken me, but it also rebuilt me into someone wiser, tougher, and more awake. I had learned that forgiveness isn't about letting people off the hook. It's about freeing yourself from the weight they put on your heart. I took a deep breath and whispered, "They tried to erase me, but I wrote myself back into the story." And in that moment, I knew my journey wasn't just about revenge. It was about rediscovery, about finding my voice, my strength, and my place in a world that had once pushed me aside. I lost a husband, nearly lost my children, and yet, somehow, I found myself. That was the real victory. That was the justice they never saw coming.